Mr. Speaker, honorable members, I am delighted that I have this opportunity to make some comments in relation to and in response to the budget speech which was delivered by the Honorable Prime Minister on Wednesday afternoon. And may I say that the Prime Minister has in fact delivered another excellent budget speech. Mr. Speaker, it is clear from the presentation that he has a command of the issues which are relevant to our development, and he is planning carefully for the execution of a plan that is going to help St. Vincent to sustain economic growth and development for a very long time. He has in fact put us on a remarkable course, and when the history of this country is told, something very significant would be said about the contribution of Dr. the Honorable Ralph Gonsalves to the development of this nation. I would like to therefore thank him and to thank the members of his team from the Ministry of Finance for the obvious hard work that they put into the preparation. And we are going to continue to make sure that after or during the course of 2015 and in years to come, the same sort of effort is put into it. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to say during the course of this budget that this has been a government of growth and development. I find that the Prime Minister was very modest when in his budget speech on Wednesday afternoon, he said that St. Vincent and the Grenadines performed better than average in terms of economic growth when compared to our OECS peers. In fact, St. Vincent and the Grenadines has been a sub-regional leader where economic growth is concerned since the ULP took office in 2001. And it is abundantly clear from all the reports that we are on course for further growth. Metaphorically, we are still able to pick up the singles, even though we are batting on a fairly difficult economic wicket. The scoreboard is ticking over, and we are more than holding our own. And I don't just want to make such a blind assertion. I want to substantiate this by reference to the facts. And the fact is that SVG had the highest annual average rate of economic growth among the independent countries of the Eastern Caribbean Currency Union between 2002 and 2013. By contrast, we had the second lowest average annual rate of economic growth for the same independent countries of the Eastern Caribbean Currency Union during the period 1985 to 2001. That tells the story by itself. And having said that, and after all these years of leading growth, we now have a gross domestic product of this country which stands in the vicinity of roughly 2 billion EC dollars, or roughly 1.95 million EC, or more accurately rather, 1.95 billion EC dollars. So it is clear that the government knows how to create growth and sustain growth even in difficult times. And there was reference already in this Honorable House during these debates to the fact that the IMF was here during late 2014. And one of the things that the IMF said in its report is that St. Vincent and the Grenadines is on the path for further growth. The IMF, in fact, anticipates further growth. This is what they had to say in their concluding statement for the 2014 Article 4 mission to St. Vincent and the Grenadines on the subject of economic growth. And the statement was published on December 1st, 2014. One, that the projected growth for 2014 is 1.1%. Two, that the projected growth for 2015 is 1.8%. And three, and I want to make this third point by reference to the exact words of the IMF on the matter, that over the medium term, Testing. Is it on?
No.
And I'm quoting the IMF directly on this particular point, that over the medium term, and they have a lot of naysayers, and they have some people who just say anything without giving it careful analysis. But according to this concluding statement, over the medium term, potential growth is expected to be enhanced by the completion of the international airport, currently projected for late 2015. It goes on to say that staff estimates that GDP growth could rise to 3% starting from 2016. So this statement, Mr. Speaker, bears repeating for emphasis, and so that those who may not have heard it before have the opportunity to hear it here. The potential growth is expected to be enhanced by the completion of the international airport. And there's a specific reference based on staff estimates to the fact that GDP growth could rise to 3% starting from 2016. Mr. Speaker, I believe that this by itself is a powerful validation and justification of the government's position in relation to the international airport. Right. And there is more to be said about the international airport and about tourism later on. On top of all this, the much discussed fall in the price of oil may well have the effect of further strengthening our growth prospects. Mr. Speaker, we heard the Honorable Leader of the Opposition yesterday, quite embarrassingly so, when he ventured to speak about the Petro-Carib arrangements without knowing clearly the facts. I think a little research on this issue would do all of us whenever we venture to speak a world of good. One, the Leader of the Opposition showed that he is not familiar with the institutional arrangements for Petro-Carib. I will not elaborate on this particular point now, but this is something that could be open to query and open to his own research. Two, he was wrong when he said that there would be no loan component if the price of oil falls below $50 per barrel. Wrong. Very wrong, Mr. Speaker. And it has already been established that the agreement for Petro-Carib contemplates prices of oil falling to as low as $15 per barrel. On top of that, Mr. Speaker, this is not the first time that oil prices have fallen since the advent of Petro-Carib. In fact, there was a very significant fall-off in the price of oil in the period 2008 to 2009, but Petro-Carib survived. And Petro-Carib, by all indications, is going to survive for a much longer time. Mr. Speaker, more than that, the Leader of the Opposition also showed very little understanding of financial issues when he referred to the Petro-Carib debt, which was recently sold, Petro-Carib debt to, well, the debt of the Dominican Republic to Petro-Carib, which was recently sold at what he described as a serious discount. The nominal figure of the debt, Mr. Speaker, was $3.5 billion. And he has not only said this in this honorable house, he said it elsewhere as well, and it's quoted in media reports. The nominal figure of the debt was $3.5 billion or thereabouts. Billion dollars or thereabouts. And US dollars. This debt was sold for $1.5 billion US dollars. And this was made out to be some very substantial discount. But if you do a little analysis, Mr. Speaker, you would see that $3.5 billion over a 25-year period is not much different from $1.5 billion now. In fact, if Venezuela or Petro-Carib were to get $1.5 billion, the $1.5 billion up front, and make an investment that provided a yield of just over 3%, which is not unreasonable within the scheme of things, they are going to end up in 25 years with over $3.5 billion, Mr. Speaker. So it is wrong and a real falsehood for us to make it out to be that Venezuela sold Petro-Carib debt at some deep discount. Mr. Speaker, having said that, we all acknowledge that the most significant development in the world economy for 2014 was the dramatic fall in the price of oil. there was a 50% drop from a high of $115 per barrel in June to less than $60 per barrel by December 2014. The prices hit their lowest level in 5.5 years, that is post-2009. It is not that, as I've already indicated, such a dramatic fall is unprecedented in economic history. There was a substantial fall in 1986 and another fall to which I've already referred in 2008 to 2009. It is not so much, Mr. Speaker, for us to examine here the roots of the 2014 oil price collapse as it is for us to consider the implications, and especially the implications for St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Now, according to the World Bank's global economic prospects, for oil importing countries, lower prices could do several things, including one, reduce inflationary pressures, and two, contribute to economic growth. These consequences are by no means restricted to the Caribbean. In fact, there was some research done, and this is research in terms of Europe, but we could learn lessons on this subject from any country, anywhere in the world. There was some research by Oxford Economics, which estimates that if the price of a barrel of oil was $60, 13 European countries will see their inflation rates go below zero, at least temporarily, in 2015. And there is some evidence to suggest that there are a lot of deflationary pressures right here in St. Vincent now. And I believe that more along those lines would be said before the conclusion of this debate. But we could learn, for example, from the example of West Germany when oil prices fell in 1986. Following that was a reduction in consumer prices. Consumer prices dropped then by up to 1% as oil prices fell, and output over the next 3 years grew by a healthy average of 2.9%. Estimates indicate that, Mr. Speaker, on a general level, a 25% fall in oil prices generates about 0.4% in economic growth. This is even more good news for St. Vincent and the Grenadines from an economic growth standpoint. So, to go through what we have just heard, one, St. Vincent and the Grenadines is on a good economic growth track by reference to our OECS peers. In fact, we are the sub-regional leader in economic growth for the independent countries of the OECS. Two, the international airport boosts our economic prospects, and it is abundantly clear that the international airport is going to be finished very soon. So, and three, the fall in oil prices bolsters even further our economic growth potential. Mr. Speaker, by any standard, this is good economic news for this country. And I've already made reference to the fact that there's a reduction in the inflationary pressure in the SVG right now, and this could be substantiated by things that the Vincentian public could see and experience for themselves. One, and this came over through a newscast. This was even reported through a news item on NBC Radio on Monday, January 12, 2015. St. Vincent and the Grenadines has seen a fourth reduction in the price of gasoline in 4 months. And this brings the total reduction to $2.56 per gallon, so that the new price stands at $12.72 per gallon. Mr. Speaker, I've observed that as a result of this fall in prices, I could now get a full tank of gas for under $150. Before, I'd have to pay $180 or thereabouts. And assuming that I look to get a full tank of gas 4 times per month, it means that I am now able to save up to $120 per month on my gas bill. And I'm sure that motorists throughout the length and breadth of this country have seen something very similar in relation to their own gas prices. The question is, what would I do with the extra $120 that I have at the end of the month? And what would the motorists generally do with the extra dollars that they have at the end of the month? And in many instances, they're very likely to spend it and contribute to the stimulation of the economy. And this is the mechanism by which the growth that we discussed a while ago can be materialized. Mr. Speaker, LIAT also announced a 50% cut in its fuel surcharge. I think this was a couple weeks ago. And the implication of this is that the cost of transportation is now down by a considerable amount. VINLEC's fuel surcharge, as the Prime Minister said during his budget speech on Wednesday, fell from 58.67 cents per unit in August 2014 to 40.65 cents per unit in December 2014. These prices are indicative of the general trend in the economy. And in general, low prices would create or would allow workers to create goods and services at lower cost, which would boost disposable income and spending, and this is good for the economy from an economic growth standpoint.
He cited a figure of 40 point something cents. In related to what?
The VINLEC fuel surcharge.
Yeah. Okay. In St. Vincent.
And that information is also in the speech, the Prime Minister's speech from Wednesday afternoon. So you could refer to it. Mr. Speaker, we could also look at things from the standpoint, we have looked at things rather from the standpoint of an oil importing country, and we are in fact an oil importing country. But we might have to consider, we should perhaps give some attention to the situation as confronting countries which export oil, such as our good friend Venezuela, that has so generously assisted us over the years with our developmental thrust to Petrocarib. We currently receive about $30 million per year through Petrocarib, and this money is used to finance social and economic programs that are important for our development. For example, the SET program, the Farmers Support Program, road repairs in various areas, and our rehabilitation in the aftermath of the December 2013 floods. This $30 million comes on very concessionary terms. The debt is paid over a 25-year period with a 2-year grace period and at 1% interest. This is an utterly sustainable arrangement. Mr. Speaker, please allow me to reiterate here that the fall in the price of oil does not amount to a collapse in Petrocarib. The Petrocarib itself agreement contemplates these fluctuating prices, and this is not the first time rather, as I've said, that oil prices have fallen since it has come into being. Mr. Speaker, I suppose that a lot of the speculation that we've heard in this honorable House and outside of the House about the collapse of Petrocarib may have been fueled by statements of international financial institutions. For example, the IMF said that Petrocarib countries will on average face a 1.6% hit to economic output if the program were terminated. But why would anyone want to concern themselves with a hypothetical scenario? The president of Venezuela himself has reaffirmed his commitment to Petrocarib. Of course, countries that are affected by oil price falls, be it Venezuela, be it Trinidad and Tobago, be it some other country in the world, would have to make adjustments and cuts in some areas. But the reality is that Petrocarib happens to be a priority area for the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. That's right. In fact, President Maduro described Petrocarib as one of the major economic areas that must continue to be pursued despite the fall in oil prices. Right. I think that is what we need to take into consideration as we fashion our approach to the debate on this budget. And even though the even though there may be a fall off in our expected receipts as a result of a decline in oil prices, this would not be very significant within the scheme of things. Mr. Speaker, and
I just wish to seek a clarification from the honourable member on the Petrocarib arrangement. My understanding is that PetroVista SVG receives a 1% agreement on that oil. Am I correct? Could you clarify whether that is in fact correct? That the 1% agreement is with PetroVista. Am I correct? Could I also conclude that nowhere in the debt schedule of this budget would we see a 1% debt? On the contrary, we will see a 6% debt with Petrocarib. So in fact, St. Vincent is not enjoying a 1% debt arrangement with Petrocarib. The records are there that it is 6%. I would like you to be very clear on that.
Mr. Speaker, the only thing that I would say in response to what the honourable member has just said is that the institutional arrangements, an understanding of the institutional arrangements would provide some clarity on the question of where the debt is provided or recorded. But more than that, St. Vincent and the Grenadines is in fact enjoying a 1% debt as a result of Petrocarib.
Because this, and I know the Honourable Prime Minister may join us at this time, we cannot play games. It was explained, it's in the Prime Minister's ministerial statement, that oil from Venezuela comes to a joint venture company, PDVSA SVG, at 1%. There is no schedule in this budget that reflects that this country has a 1% debt to Petrocarib or Venezuela or anyone else. The records are clear, manifestly clear, that it's a 6% debt. Even when the Prime Minister intervened and said it should have been 4%, the estimates were passed without any amendments. So it did not move from the 6 to the 4%. It remained on the books as a 6% debt. The 1% debt is between PDVSA, SVG, and Venezuela. And that's a fundamental difference.
Mr. Speaker, unfortunately, if you may permit me, my honourable friend either misunderstood what I said, or I didn't speak with sufficient clarity. But I thought that I had spoken with clarity. It's this. There are two companies. The PDV Carib Company, PDV Carib SVG, which is the agency of the government of Venezuela, which is 100% owned by the government of Venezuela. That is what deals with PDVSA, the company in Venezuela which produces the fuel and distributes it. Petrocarib, in that company, the government of St. Vincent and the Grenadines is a minority shareholder. And we have 2 directors there as against 3 who are from Venezuela. Petrocarib SVG Limited is a wholly owned company by the government of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. VINLEC is the only purchaser of the fuel from PDV Carib SVG. That company, that Venezuelan company here. And when the fuel comes, that company deals with VINLEC. VINLEC will pay the 100% for the fuel within the 90-day period, which is given under the agreement. And that Venezuelan company here will transfer to PDVSA the short-term portion of the money and will transfer to Petrocarib the long-term portion, which the Honorable Senator Brown spoke about, 25 years, 2 years grace at 1%, to the wholly owned company of the government of St. Vincent and the Grenadines called Petrocarib SVG Limited. Petrocarib SVG Limited, under the directions of the cabinet, it has its own board, but the cabinet can direct any state-owned company. It can direct VINLEC, it can direct national properties. And what it does, the allocation is made by the Petrocarib SVG Limited to various developments. So it would, in the case of the loans to the airport company, that is one state company to another state company, the interest is written at 6%, but as I explained, it should have been 3%. And that has been reconfirmed yet again. But that is the airport company's indebtedness on that loan to Petrocarib, but also it's one government, but because the same shareholder, but each has its own juridical personality. Each has its own juridical personality. So those are the facts. You may come to what conclusion you want. I will have a conclusion which may not square, or an opinion which doesn't square with that of the honorable member for Central Kingston or anywhere else. But when we are having any differences of opinion about it, let us have the factual matrices correct. I think I explained that in my ministerial statement. I do that here again, as I've done on several occasions. I will speak, no doubt, when I wind up on it again, but I don't want to disrupt the debate because Honorable Senator Brown has his time, and properly speaking, I shouldn't intervene at this time, but given the leave of the Speaker and the request by the opposition, and the Honorable Senator Brown has permitted me also, that I've done it in the interest of clarity and public information. I'm obliged.
Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful to the Honorable Prime Minister because this is so fundamental an issue.
But did you appreciate the difference?
Well, Mr. Speaker, there's no difference. The Honorable Prime Minister is in a web that he has weaved from which he will not escape. And I'm going to quote, Mr. Speaker,
So
Mr. Speaker, with your permission.
No, but hold on.
Mr. Speaker.
Hold on. Let's do it this way. If you want to, I think you should pick that point up in your presentation because
Mr. Speaker,
I think you should pick the point up.
M者Speaker.
Honorable member.
I'm going to close with half a minute of your time, Mr. Half a minute of your time, Mr. Speaker.
I think you should pick the point up in your presentation.
I certainly will, Mr. Speaker, as he would in his wind-up. But I want to conclude on this. I beg your indulgence, Mr. Speaker.
I think you should pick the point
Speaker
up.
who drew the case. This no allow the Speaker to make a judgment.
Honorable member, I think you should pick the point up in your presentation because the distinction was pellucidly clear to me.
Not pellucidly clear. Not pellucidly clear. And that's why we cannot let it stand, Mr. Speaker.
You should pick it up.
The Honorable Prime Minister says that not one single cent comes from the consolidated fund.
Honorable
to
member.
repay any loan. And therefore it means that the government does not owe. That's what it means. If the consolidated fund is not paying, the government does not
the
owe.
authority of the chair.
Well, I regret the disrespect. That was provoked.
But you can't.
But we must not manipulate the people of St. Vincent and the Grenadines and this parliament. These are the factual matrix, and this is what will stand.
Have a chance to present.
This is what will stand. We have been unlawful in our conduct.
But you can.
But that's your business. That's your business.
Honorable member.
That's your business.
Honorable member. Honorable member. You got the latitude this time. You are not going to get it again. Proceed.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. I'm happy I'm happy that the Honorable
Easy
Prime
enough.
Minister was able to provide some clarification on this
Be
matter.
afraid. I'm just asking you to respect the authority of the House. The chair. Proceed, Senator.
I'm happy that the Honorable Prime Minister was able to provide some clarification. Obviously, the fact that the government has an arrangement that could contribute to the development of the people is rubbing some members of the opposition the wrong way. But we are thankful for this arrangement, and we're thankful for the benefits that it has brought to the people of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. And even amid some of the agitation that I see on the part of members of the opposition, I'd like to make one further point in relation to Petrocarib, because it has often been bandied about that this is an arrangement that promotes our dependence on Venezuela for oil. But if the truth be told, Venezuela has expressed in the very foundational documents an interest in helping to wean us off of oil products and whatnot. In fact, there's talk about energy efficiency, and this is the commitment on energy efficiency. One essential feature of the agreement shall be to add energy-saving programs to supply-related agreements. In this regard, Petrocarib may arrange credits and exchange technologies to enable beneficiary countries to develop highly functional energy-efficient programs and systems, as well as other measures making it possible for them to reduce their oil consumption and to provide a wider range of services. So it is clear that even while it is in Venezuela's interest to sell us oil and to sell us as much oil as possible, there is a contemplation towards renewable sources of energy and other sources of energy which would be in our long-term interest. I know that the Honorable Senator Camilo Gonzalez just returned from a forum in the United States where the matter of renewable energy, or other alternative types of energy at least, was the subject of discussion. And from the presentation that the Prime Minister made here, there's a lot of interest along those lines from our own government. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to turn, Mr. Speaker, I am assuming that I would not be penalized for the time which was used for the exchanges a while ago.
You will not be penalized.
For the injury time, though hardly an injury was done. But I'd like to turn my attention for a while to matters concerning the deficit and debt. Having recently read a Financial Times article on the question of debt sustainability around the world. To do so, Mr. Speaker, would first require us to look at government revenues. We've already established that there has been GDP growth over the years and that this growth is projected to continue. What has been left unsaid up to this point is the fact that there has been an even faster growth in government recurrent revenue, which is up to now, as you would see from the estimates, just over $530 million. What percent of this revenue is used to service our national debt? Well, there are interest payments, which amount to $52 million, or $52.6 million. There's amortization amounting to just over $101 million. And there are sinking fund contributions, which amount to just under $13 million. The total, therefore, for this debt servicing is just under $167 million, or 31.3% of current income. The Prime Minister, in his speech, mentioned that he would like to see this figure decline. But I make the point, nonetheless, that we are not at an unmanageable place. We're not in an unmanageable situation by any stretch of the imagination. When you look at the way in which commercial banks function, for example, and many of us would have loans at commercial banks, you would see that they normally cap the debt service ratio at 40% or thereabouts. And when you look at the position of this government, you recognize that we are a long way from there. The current account deficit, Mr. Speaker, currently stands at just under $143 million, is on a reducing trajectory because we have a reducing trajectory of fiscal deficits. And this is the case. This is an important point to make because we have, admittedly, current account deficit of a certain size now. But the government, through its projections for 2016 and 2017, indicate its own interest in making sure that these deficits are reduced over time. And in fact, as we have economic growth, it would be very easy for us to experience this reduction in fiscal deficit. So we have a reduction projected. The current level of total public debt, and you would be able to gather this information from page 631 of the estimates, is $1.5 billion. And for the sake of comparison, we could look at the debt to GDP ratio in some other countries, including St. Vincent. We have a figure of about 77% or thereabouts, and that is for local debt and for external debt. Mr. Speaker, you might be alarmed because when we talk about adverse debt to GDP ratios, we often refer to St. Kitts and Nevis, which over the past few years has had a very high debt to GDP ratio. But in my research, I looked at the case of Japan. And as we speak, Mr. Speaker, Japan has a debt to GDP ratio in the vicinity of 245%. On the other extreme, we have a country like China, and we know that China has been an economic leader where growth is concerned for many years, and China has a debt to GDP ratio of about 41%. Looking at the overall picture in the average, we see that gross government debts of developed countries now stand at an annual average of 108% of GDP, according to the latest Geneva report. And it is helpful to note, and I think that honorable members already know this. In fact, I saw that the Honorable Sinclair Leacock made a favorable comment about the fact that in St. Vincent, the debt to GDP ratio is within a reasonable range in a presentation that he made not so long ago in this honorable house. Mr. Speaker, the IMF operates with a rule of thumb which says that developed countries should try to keep their debts to below 85% of GDP, while emerging economies should try to keep their debts below 70% of GDP. But Mr. Speaker, what I want to do here is to refer to some economic research. There's a book that was recently written by a group of professors, a book called This Time is Different. And it shows that the average external, because ultimately, when you're talking about the debt situation in any country, what you're really trying to figure out is whether or not a government is likely to default on its debt. And this group of professors did a study of debt to GDP ratios and found that countries which defaulted during the period 1970 to 2008 had a debt to GDP ratio of 69.3% on average, an external debt to GDP ratio of 69.3% on average. And while I have given the figure for the overall debt to GDP ratio, we could look at page 631, and thereon we would also find the figure for the external debt to GDP ratio, Mr. Speaker. Yeah. Looking at that page, you would see that our external debt to GDP ratio, and this is not even to just look narrowly at the central government, is just 45.3%. So we have this publication, and This Time is Different. This Time is Different, and I encourage honorable members to look at it, which says that from their studies for the period 1970 to 2008, countries which defaulted had on average debt to GDP ratios of 69.3%. And for external debt. And what you see from looking at this case of St. Vincent and the Grenadines is that we're well short of this mark. The debt to GDP ratio for external debt has not even crossed the 50% threshold. So based...
Honorable Senator, you have 15 minutes.
Really? Yes. Mr. Speaker,
you actually got the 8 minutes back.
Sorry? Actually got, okay, Mr. Speaker, well, that is rather startling because I thought I was just getting going.
Well, keep on going.
Perhaps since I'm accustomed to building long innings, it seems as if I just, looking at the pace of the ball and scoring some runs as we go along.
You have 15 minutes.
I see a certain honourable member seeming startled. But, so Mr. Speaker, we have a clear case where we are well within the realm of reasonable debt management. And of course, we would never want to become complacent or to become spendthrift. Or I referred to that very early on. Take your time. I referred to that very early on, honorable member. So, most importantly as well, on this score is the fact that St. Vincent and the Grenadines has no history of default. So we are in a decent credit position, all things considered. The debt service ratio is not out of control. It is within the 40% benchmark that you typically find when you go for a loan at commercial banks. The debt to GDP ratio is at a reasonable level, and in fact it is far lower than levels which would indicate some risk of default. And there is no history of default whatsoever. So those are some very significant things for us to note when we are contemplating the debt situation in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. So, Mr. Speaker, we have seen that there has been economic growth, there has been growth in current revenue, the debt has been kept within manageable limits, and this is a tribute to the performance of the government and to the skillful negotiations of Prime Minister Gonsalves in relation to debt relief on many areas. Mr. Speaker, in light of the constraints of time, I'd just like to say some things in terms of tourism, sports, and culture. And you would know that I serve currently as the parliamentary secretary in that ministry. And as picking up on some of the things that the Honourable Minister has already said, the importance of tourism to regional economies can hardly be overstated, especially since during the 1990s there was the elimination of agricultural trade preferences. Tourist expenditure currently accounts for about 13% of our GDP. There was a recent working paper entitled Revisiting Tourism Flows to the Caribbean, What is Driving Arrivals, which found that tourism is the main driver of economic growth and employment and a key source of government revenue in regional economies. This is why it was so important for us to build an international airport, since it would improve access to our country and therefore have a positive impact on tourist arrivals and therefore expenditure. The number of airlines also has after the airport is completed, would also have a very statistically significant impact on these variables of tourist arrivals and expenditure. And this is why the very IMF itself concluded that the completion of the airport will fuel economic growth, further economic growth in St. Vincent here. Now, we must not take the potential increase in arrivals lightly at all, because much has been made about the fact that St. Vincent and the Grenadines, in comparison to other countries in the Caribbean and within the OECS, has relatively low stayover visitors and a relatively low amounts of visitors in other categories. There has been no reference to the history that have us in this position. There's no reference to the fact that there's limited access to the destination right now. And more than that, there is no reference to the fact that since we are starting at comparatively low levels, it indicates that there is a tremendous potential for growth. Right now, we have just over 70,000, and we've been up in some years to up to 80,000 and a bit more. We just have over 70,000 stayover arrivals at the moment. And we look to our neighbor, St. Lucia, and you see that St. Lucia has over 300,000 stayover arrivals annually. Even if we want to be conservative, Mr. Speaker, there is nothing that would prevent us from seeing a significant or a rapid increase in arrivals to St. Vincent when the airport or the international airport becomes operational. Mr. Speaker, I know, for example, in the case of Taiwan, Taiwan was able to experience considerable growth in their tourist arrivals over a 10-year period. And I will refer to the precise figures here, Mr. Speaker. In 2004, Taiwan, a country with which we have diplomatic relations with, in 2004, stayover or tourists in Taiwan amounted to just under 3 million. The number of tourists that visited Taiwan, just under 3 million. By 2014, they had transformed that situation so that stayover arrivals was just under 10 million. So in 10 years, they tripled the number of tourists that came to their country. And that is evidence that there could be rapid growth in tourist arrivals, and we have a lot to learn from that in the case of St. Vincent. Mr. Speaker, since we have about 80,000, stayover visitors right now, and since there are countries right within this region that have up to 300,000 stayover visitors, Mr. Speaker, it is plausible that with the international airport under our belt, over the next 10 years or so, we could, even though we don't think about or don't say that we're going to triple arrivals, we could plausibly add 100,000 stayover visitors to our shows with the operationalization of the international airport. And I want to reiterate here the fact that this stands to have a very serious impact on our economy. Because in a situation where we have, and some people doubt whether or not the airport will become operational, and I don't think that the public is joining them in that doubt. That's right. But more than that, the people who are investing in tourism, they are not also joining them in that doubt, because we have a heightened activity of investment in tourism-related infrastructure. So if people did not buy into this concept of an international airport and what it would mean, there will not be this sort of investment. And Mr. Speaker, I don't just want to talk loosely about the fact that there has been a high level of investment. And in this matter, I'm not simply talking about investment by locals. The locals have invested. And in the presentation yesterday by the Honorable Leader of the Opposition, he made reference to the fact that we need to encourage or to generate more foreign direct investment. But I think he probably made that reference without looking at the figures related to foreign direct investment for St. Vincent and the Grenadines compared to the figures for the same thing in other countries. And the time isn't there for me to go through it thoroughly. But just to give you a sense of what is happening, and we could look at the period post-2008, so starting from 2009, because that is a different economic era. That is the era after we had the global collapse. Since 2009, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and from 2000, we're looking at figures from 2009 to 2013. Since 2009, between 2009 and 2013, St. Vincent and the Grenadines has generated more foreign direct investment than countries like Antigua and Barbuda.
Honorable Senator, you have 3 minutes.
And this comes from a report on foreign direct investment in Latin America and the Caribbean that was done by the United Nations. So this is a document that they could find, Mr. Speaker. So it is clear that people believe in the potential of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and people believe that the completion of the international airport, the investors, the IMF, Vincentians generally, and others believe that the completion of the international airport is going to lead to greater arrivals and, as a result of leading to greater arrivals, contribute to economic growth. And this is something to consider. We could possibly increase our arrivals by 100,000. You know what an increase of 100,000 in arrivals means for the economy of this country? Each stayover tourist, according to the information I have, spends about $4,500 in St. Vincent. If you increase arrivals by 100,000, you'd be looking at a scenario where we have an additional $450,000 of expenditure to work. $450 million, sorry. $450 million in expenditure to work with. An additional $450 million in expenditure is going to lead to an additional $100 or so million in tax revenue. Oh, out of this, I'm looking at a conservative scenario. I'm looking at a conservative scenario, and the truth is, we won't have to wait very long to see exactly where the figures go. Mr. Speaker, this additional $100,000 in $100 million in tax revenue could be easily used to service whatever debt we've incurred to build the airport, and to fix roads, and to build hospitals, and to carry out more social programs as the government sees fit. Mr. Speaker, there are more things that I had in mind to say about tourism, and there are some things that I also wanted to say about sports, by reference to the National Economic and Social
things, but you have 1 minute within which to say it.
Social Development Plan. And Mr. Speaker, I hope that an opportunity would present itself for me to get into the details of some of those matters, except to say that the government is, in addition to several other things, making sure that we provide sporting facilities and recreational facilities that are of acceptable standards for use by the people of this country, including the Camden Park stands, which is earmarked for development, including the development of a playing field in Cumberland and in other areas. Mr. Speaker, having said that, I just close with... Okay, well, the Honorable Minister said that he will deal with the parts that I'm not able to touch right now. Mr. Speaker,
time is up.
If you will just allow me to say a quick word to the constituency of East Kingstown, because I don't want to be just craving your indulgence for a little while, and I will tie in my remarks in relation to the accident in Fancy, because the Honorable Speaker did say that these remarks would not be subject to the time constraints. So
the Honorable Speaker
the Honorable Speaker made that proclamation.
I thought I was the Speaker.
the substantive speaker. But I'd just like to say, Mr. Speaker, very quickly.
But you have to round it up, though.
Yes, I am rounding it up, and I'm just making use of the grace extended by the Speaker in relation to comments on the accident. I'd just like to say that there is something in store for the people of East Kingstown in these estimates. I noticed that the current representative did not worry to say anything about the constituency that he proposed to represent in his speech. And, I would like to say one thing, since he likes to make the vain boast, Mr. Speaker, that he's been the representative for 16 years, but what does he have to show for it? That is the question that has to be asked. And having said that, the road work, which is going to happen nationally, is also going to have impact on the constituency level, Mr. Speaker. And I'd like to say...
Honorable Senator.
Just in concluding, Mr. Speaker.
You have to conclude this.
Just in concluding, Mr. Speaker. Though it may not be Christmas greetings, I extend greetings to the people of that constituency for the new year. And I'm going to continue to work hard in a number of areas for your benefit. And I'd like to say to the people of Fancy that our thoughts and prayers continue to be with you as you continue to mourn the tragic loss of lives of school children as they traveled to school one early morning. And this government has already expressed its interest in making sure that a transition back to normalcy will be as seamless as possible, as though normalcy may never really return in the same way. Mr. Speaker, we just have to see how best we could pick up and move on in the aftermath of events such as these and continue to hold things together with the grace of God. I thank you for your indulgence, and I hope that I have another opportunity to continue saying some things relevant to the development of this country. I'm obliged.